Sigmund Freud, Totem and Taboo, from the standard edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, Volume 13, translated and edited by James Strachey. Totem and Taboo, Essay 4, The Return of Totemism in Childhood, Parts 5 to the end of the text. Part 5. Let us call up the spectacle of a totem meal of the kind we have been discussing, amplified by a few probable features which we have not yet been able to consider. The clan is celebrating the ceremonial occasion by the cruel slaughter of its totem animal and is devouring it raw, blood, flesh, and bones. The clansmen are there, dressed in the likeness of the totem, and imitating it in sound and movement, as though they are seeking to stress their identity with it. Each man is conscious that he is performing an act forbidden to the individual, and justifiable only through the participation of the whole clan, nor may anyone absent himself from the killing and the meal. When the deed is done, the slaughtered animal is lamented and bewailed. The mourning is obligatory, imposed by dread of a threatened retribution. As Robertson Smith, 1894, page 412, remarks, of an analogous occasion, its chief purpose is to disclaim responsibility for the killing. But the mourning is followed by demonstrations of festive rejoicing. Every instinct is unfettered, and there is license for every kind of gratification. Here we have easy access to an understanding of the nature of festivals in general. A festival is a permitted or rather an obligatory excess, a solemn breach of a prohibition. It is not that men commit the excesses because they are feeling happy as a result of some injunction they have received. It is rather that excess is of the essence of a festival. The festive feeling is produced by the liberty to do what is as a rule prohibited. What are we to make, though, of the prelude to this festive joy? The mourning over the death of the animal. If the clansmen rejoice over the killing of the totem, a normally forbidden act, why do they mourn over it as well? As we have seen, the clansmen acquire sanctity by consuming the totem. They reinforce their identification with it and with one another. Their festive feelings and all that follows from them might well be explained by the fact that they have taken into themselves the sacred life of which the substance of the totem is the vehicle. Psychoanalysis has revealed that the totem animal is in reality a substitute for the father, and this tallies with the contradictory fact that though the killing of the animal is as a rule forbidden, yet its killing is a festive occasion, with the fact that it is killed and yet mourned. The ambivalent emotional attitude, which to this day characterizes the father complex in our children, and which often persists into adult life, seems to extend to the totem animal in its capacity as substitute for the father. If now we bring together the psychoanalytic translation of the totem with the fact of the totem meal, and with Darwin's theories of the earliest state of human society, the possibility of a deeper understanding emerges, a glimpse of a hypothesis which may seem fantastic, but which offers the advantage of establishing an unsuspected correlation between groups of phenomena that have hitherto been disconnected. There is, of course, no place for the beginnings of totemism in Darwin's primal horde. All that we find there is a violent and jealous father who keeps all the females for himself and drives away his sons as they grow up. This earliest state of primitive society has never been an object of observation. The most primitive kind of organization that we actually come across, and one that is enforced to this day in certain tribes, consists of bands of males. These bands are composed of members with equal rights and are subject to the restrictions of the totemic system, including inheritance through the mother. Can this form of organization have developed out of the other one? And if so, along what lines? If we call the celebration of the totem meal to our help, we shall be able to find an answer. One day, footnote 1, to avoid possible misunderstanding, I must ask the reader to take into account the final sentences of the following footnote as a corrective to this description. If we call the celebration of the totem meal to our help, we shall be able to find an answer. One day the brothers who had been driven out came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end of the patriarchal horde. United, they had the courage to do, and succeeded in doing, what would have been impossible for them individually. Some cultural advance, perhaps, command over some new weapon, had given them a sense of superior strength. Cannibal savages as they were, it goes without saying that they devoured their victim as well as killing him. The violent primal father had doubtless been the feared and envied model of each one of the company of brothers, and in the act of devouring him, they accomplished their identification with him, and each one of them acquired a portion of his strength. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, would thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. Footnote 1. This hypothesis, which has such a monstrous air of the tyrannical father being overwhelmed and killed by a combination of his exiled sons, was also arrived at by Atkinson, 1903, page 220, and the following pages. As a direct implication of the state of affairs in Darwin's primal horde, quote, the patriarch had only one enemy whom he should dread, a youthful band of brothers living together in forced celibacy, or at most in polyandrous relation with some single female captive. A horde as yet weak in their impubescence, they are, but they would, when strength was gained with time, inevitably wrench by combined attacks, renewed again and again, both wife and life from the paternal tyrant. End quote. Atkinson, who incidentally passed his whole life in New Caledonia and had unusual opportunities for studying the natives, also pointed out that the conditions which Darwin assumed to prevail in the primal horde may easily be observed in herds of wild oxen and horses, and regularly lead to the killing of the father of the herd. Ibid, page 222 in the following pages. He further supposed that after the father had been disposed of, the horde would be disintegrated by a bitter struggle between the victorious sons. Thus, any new organization of society would be precluded. There would be an ever-recurring violent succession to the solitary paternal tyrant, by sons whose parricidal hands were so soon again clenched in fratricidal strife. Ibid, page 228. Atkinson, who had no psychoanalytic hints to help him, and who was ignorant of Robertson Smith's studies, found a less violent transition from the primal horde to the next social stage, at which numbers of males lived together in a peaceable community. He believed that through the intervention of maternal love, the sons, to begin with only the youngest, but later others as well, were allowed to remain with the horde, and that in return for this toleration, the sons acknowledged their father's sexual privilege by renouncing all claims to their mothers and sisters. Ibid, page 231 in the following pages. Such is the highly remarkable theory put forward by Atkinson. In its essential feature, it is in agreement with my own, but its divergence results in its failing to effect a correlation with many other issues. The lack of precision in what I have written in the text above, its abbreviation of the time factor, and its compression of the whole subject matter may be attributed to the reserve necessitated by the nature of the topic. It would be as foolish to aim at exactitude in such questions as it would be unfair to insist upon certainty. Returning to the main text. In order that these latter consequences may seem plausible, leaving their premises on one side, we need only suppose that the tumultuous mob of brothers were filled with the same contradictory feelings which we can see at work in the ambivalent father complexes of our children and of our neurotic patients. They hated their father, who presented such a formidable obstacle to their craving for power and their sexual desires, but they loved and admired him too. After they had got rid of him, had satisfied their hatred, and had put into effect their wish to identify themselves with him, the affection which had all this time been pushed under was bound to make itself felt. Footnote 1. This fresh emotional attitude must also have been assisted by the fact that the deed cannot have given complete satisfaction to those who did it. From one point of view, it had been done in vain. Not one of the sons had in fact been able to put his original wish of taking his father's place into effect, and, as we know, failure is far more propitious for a moral reaction than satisfaction. Returning to the main text. It did so in the form of remorse. A sense of guilt made its appearance, which in this instance coincided with the remorse felt by the whole group. The dead father became stronger than the living one had been, for events took the course we so often see them follow in human affairs to this day. What had up to then been prevented by his actual existence was thenceforward prohibited by the sons themselves, in accordance with the psychological procedure so familiar to us in psychoanalyses under the name of deferred obedience. They revoked their deed by forbidding the killing of the totem, the substitute for their father, and they renounced its fruits by resigning their claim to the women who had now been set free. They thus created out of their filial sense of guilt the two fundamental taboos of totemism, which for that very reason inevitably correspond to the two repressed wishes of the Oedipus complex. Whoever contravened those taboos became guilty of the only two crimes with which primitive society concerned itself. Footnote 2. Murder and incest, or offenses of a like kind against the sacred laws of blood, are in primitive society the only crimes of which the community as such takes cognizance. Smith, 1894, page 419. The two taboos of totemism with which human morality has its beginning are not on a par psychologically. The first of them, the law protecting the totem animal, is founded wholly on emotional motives. The father had actually been eliminated, and in no real sense could the deed be undone. But the second rule, the prohibition of incest, has a powerful practical basis as well. Sexual desires do not unite men, but divide them. Though the brothers had banded together in order to overcome their father, they were all one another's rivals in regard to the women. Each of them would have wished, like his father, to have all the women to himself. The new organization would have collapsed in a struggle of all against all, for none of them was of such overmastering strength as to be able to take on his father's part with success. Thus the brothers had no alternative if they were to live together, but not, perhaps until they had passed through many dangerous crises, to institute the law against incest, by which they all alike renounced the women whom they desired, and who had been their chief motive for dispatching their father. In this way, they rescued the organization which had made them strong, and which may have been based on homosexual feelings and acts, originating perhaps during the period of their expulsion from the horde. Here, too, may perhaps have been the germ of the institution of matriarchy, described by Bachofen, 1861, which was in turn replaced by the patriarchal organization of the family. On the other hand, the claim of totemism to be regarded as a first attempt at a religion is based on the first of these two taboos, that upon taking the life of the totem animal. The animal struck the sons as a natural and obvious substitute for their father, but the treatment of it which they found imposed on themselves expressed more than the need to exhibit their remorse. They could attempt, in their relation to this surrogate father, to allay their burning sense of guilt, to bring about a kind of reconciliation with their father. The totemic system was, as it were, a covenant with their father, in which he promised them everything that a childish imagination may expect from a father: protection, care, and indulgence, while, on their side, they undertook to respect his life, that is to say, not to repeat the deed which had brought destruction on their real father. Totemism, moreover, contained an attempt at self-justification. If our father had treated us in the way the totem does, we should never have felt tempted to kill him. In this fashion, totemism helped to smooth things over and to make it possible to forget the event to which it owed its origin. Features were thus brought into existence, which continued thenceforward to have a determining influence on the nature of religion. Totemic religion arose from the filial sense of guilt, in an attempt to allay that feeling and to appease the father by deferred obedience to him. All later religions are seen to be attempts at solving the same problem. They vary according to the stage of civilization at which they arise, and according to the methods which they adopt, but all have the same end in view, and are reactions to the same great event with which civilization began, and which, since it occurred, has not allowed mankind a moment's rest. There is another feature which was already present in totemism, and which has been preserved unaltered in religion. The tension of ambivalence was evidently too great for any contrivance to be able to counteract it, or it is possible that psychological conditions in general are unfavorable to getting rid of these antithetical emotions. However that may be, we find that the ambivalence implicit in the father complex persists in totemism and in religions generally. Totemic religion not only comprised expressions of remorse and attempts at atonement, it also served as a remembrance of the triumph over the father. Satisfaction over that triumph led to the institution of the memorial festival of the totem meal, in which the restrictions of deferred obedience no longer held. Thus it became a duty to repeat the crime of parricide again and again in the sacrifice of the totem animal, whenever, as a result of the changing conditions of life, the cherished fruit of the crime, appropriation of the paternal attributes, threatened to disappear. We shall not be surprised to find that the element of filial rebelliousness also emerges in the later products of religion, often in the strangest disguises and transformations. Hitherto we have followed the development of the affectionate current of feeling towards the father, transformed into remorse, as we find them in religion and in moral ordinances, which are not sharply distinguished in totemism. But we must not overlook the fact that it was in the main with the impulses that led to parricide that the victory lay. For a long time afterwards, the social fraternal feelings, which were the basis of the whole transformation, continued to exercise a profound influence on the development of society. They found expression in the sanctification of the blood tie, in the emphasis upon the solidarity of all life within the same clan, and thus guaranteeing one another's lives. The brothers were declaring that no one of them must be treated by another as their father was treated by them, all jointly. They were precluding the possibility of a repetition of their father's fate. To the religiously based prohibition against killing the totem was now added the socially based prohibition against fratricide. It was not until long afterwards that the prohibition ceased to be limited to members of the clan and assumed the simple form, thou shalt do no murder. The patriarchal horde was replaced in the first instance by the fraternal clan, whose existence was assured by the blood tie. Society was now based on complicity in the common crime. Religion was based on the sense of guilt and the remorse attaching to it, while morality was based partly on the exigencies of this society and partly on the penance demanded by the sense of guilt. Thus, psychoanalysis, in contradiction to the more recent views of the totemic system, but in agreement with the earlier ones, requires us to assume that totemism and exogamy were intimately connected and had a simultaneous origin. 6. A great number of powerful motives restrain me from any attempt at picturing the further development of religions from their origin in totemism to their condition today. I will only follow two threads whose course I can trace with a special clarity, as they run through the pattern: the theme of the totemic sacrifice and the relation of son to father. Footnote 1. Confer the discussion by C.G. Jung, 1912, which is governed by views differing in certain respects from mine. Returning to the main text. I will only follow two threads whose course I can trace with a special clarity, as they run through the pattern: the theme of the totemic sacrifice and the relation of son to father. Robertson Smith has shown us that the ancient totem meal recurs in the original form of sacrifice. The meaning of the act is the same: sanctification through participation in a common meal. The sense of guilt, which can only be allayed by the solidarity of all the participants, also persists. What is new is the clan deity, in whose supposed presence the sacrifice is performed, who participates in the meal as though he were a clansman, and with whom those who consume the meal become identified. How does the God come to be in a situation to which he was originally a stranger? The answer might be that in the meantime the concept of God had emerged from some unknown source and had taken control of the whole of religious life, and that, like everything else that was to survive, the totem meal had been obliged to find a point of contact with the new system. The psychoanalysis of individual human beings, however, teaches us with quite special insistence that the God of each of them is formed in the likeness of his Father, that his personal relation to God depends on his relation to his Father in the flesh, and oscillates and changes along with that relation, and that at bottom God is nothing other than an exalted Father. As in the case of totemism, psychoanalysis recommends us to have faith in the believers who call God their Father, just as the totem was called the tribal ancestor. If psychoanalysis deserves any attention, then, without prejudice to any other sources or meanings of the concept of God, upon which psychoanalysis can throw no light, the paternal element in that concept must be a most important one. But in that case, the Father is represented twice over in the situation of primitive sacrifice, once as God and once as the totemic animal victim. And, even granting the restricted number of explanations open to psychoanalysis, one must ask whether this is possible and what sense it can have. We know that there are a multiplicity of relations between the God and the sacred animal, the totem or the sacrificial victim. 1. Each God usually has an animal, and quite often several animals sacred to him. 2. In the case of certain specially sacred sacrifices, mystic sacrifices, the victim was precisely the animal sacred to the God. Smith, 1894, page 290. 3. The God was often worshipped in the shape of an animal, or, to look at it in another way, animals were worshipped as gods, long after the age of totemism. 4. In myths, the God often transforms himself into an animal, and frequently into the animal that is sacred to him. It therefore seems plausible to suppose that the God himself was the totem animal, and that he developed out of it at a later stage of religious feeling. But we are relieved from the necessity for further discussion by the consideration that the totem is nothing other than a surrogate of the Father. Thus, while the totem may be the first form of the Father surrogate, the God will be a later one, in which the Father has regained his human shape. A new creation such as this, derived from what constitutes the root of every form of religion, a longing for the Father, might occur if in the process of time some fundamental change had taken place in man's relation to the Father, and perhaps too in his relation to animals. Signs of the occurrence of changes of this kind may easily be seen, even if we leave on one side the beginning of a mental estrangement from animals and the disrupting of totemism owing to domestication. See above, page 136, F. There was one factor in the state of affairs produced by the elimination of the Father, which was bound in the course of time to cause an enormous increase in the longing felt for him. Each single one of the brothers who had banded together for the purpose of killing their father was inspired by a wish to become like him, and had given expression to it by incorporating parts of their father's surrogate in the totem meal. But in consequence of the pressure exercised upon each participant by the fraternal clan as a whole, that wish could not be fulfilled. For the future, no one could or might ever again attain the Father's supreme power, even though that was what all of them had striven for. Thus, after a long lapse of time, their bitterness against their Father, which had driven them to their deed, grew less, and their longing for him increased, and it became possible for an ideal to emerge which embodied the unlimited power of the primal Father, against whom they had once fought, as well as their readiness to submit to him. As a result of decisive cultural changes, the original democratic quality that had prevailed among all the individual clansmen became untenable, and there developed at the same time an inclination, based on veneration felt for particular human individuals, to revive the ancient paternal ideal by creating gods. The notion of a man becoming a god, or of a god dying strikes us today as shockingly presumptuous, but even in classical antiquity there was nothing revolting in it. Footnote 1. To us moderns, for whom the breach which divides the human and the divine has deepened into an impassable gulf, such mimicry may appear impious, but it was otherwise with the ancients. To their thinking, gods and men were akin, for many families trace their descent from a divinity, and the deification of a man probably seemed a little extraordinary to them, as the canonization of a saint seems to a modern Catholic. Fraser, 1911a, Volume 2, page 177f. Returning to the main text. The notion of a man becoming a god or of a god dying strikes us today as shockingly presumptuous, but even in classical antiquity there was nothing revolting in it. The elevation of the father, who had once been murdered, into a god, from whom the clan claimed descent, was a far more serious attempt at atonement than had been the ancient covenant with the totem. I cannot suggest at what point in this process of development a place is to be found for the great mother goddess, who may perhaps in general have preceded the father gods. It seems certain, however, that the change in attitude to the father was not restricted to the sphere of religion, but that it extended in a consistent manner to that other side of human life which had been affected by the father's removal, to social organization. With the introduction of father deities, a fatherless society gradually changed into one organized on a patriarchal basis. The family was a restoration of the formal primal horde, and it gave back to fathers a large portion of their former rights. There were once more fathers, but the social achievements of the fraternal clan had not been abandoned, and the gulf between the new fathers of a family and the unrestricted primal father of the horde was wide enough to guarantee the continuance of the religious craving, the persistence of an unappeased longing for the father. We see then that in the scene of sacrifice before the god of the clan, the father is in fact represented twice over, as the god and as the totemic animal victim. But in our attempts at understanding this situation, we must beware of interpretations which seek to translate it in a two-dimensional fashion, as though it were an allegory, and which in so doing forget its historical stratification. The twofold presence of the father corresponds to the two chronologically successive meanings of the scene. The ambivalent attitude towards the father has found a plastic expression in it, and so too has the victory of the son's affectionate emotions over his hostile ones. The scene of the father's vanquishment, of his greatest defeat, has become the stuff for the representation of his supreme triumph. The importance which is everywhere, without exception, ascribed to sacrifice, lies in the fact that it offers satisfaction to the father for the outrage inflicted on him, in the same act in which that deed is commemorated. As time went on, the animal lost its sacred character, and the sacrifice lost its connection with the totem feast. It became a simple offering to the deity, an act of renunciation in favor of the god. God himself had become so far exalted above mankind that he could only be approached through an intermediary, the priest. At the same time, divine kings made their appearance in the social structure and introduced the patriarchal system into the state. It must be confessed that the revenge taken by the deposed and restored father was a harsh one. The dominance of authority was at its climax. The subjugated sons made use of the new situation in order to unburden themselves still further of their sense of guilt. They were no longer in any way responsible for the sacrifice as it now was. It was God himself who demanded it and regulated it. This is the phase in which we find myths showing the god himself killing the animal, which is sacred to him, and which is, in fact, himself. Here we have the most extreme denial of the great crime, which was the beginning of society, and of the sense of guilt. But there is a second meaning to this last picture of sacrifice which is unmistakable. It expresses satisfaction at the earlier father surrogate having been abandoned in favor of the superior concept of God. At this point, the psychoanalytic interpretation of the scene coincides approximately with the allegorical, surface translation of it, which represents the god as overcoming the animal side of his own nature. Footnote 1. It is generally agreed that when, in mythologies, one generation of gods is overcome by another, what is denoted is the historical replacement of one religious system by a new one, whether as a result of foreign conquest or of psychological development. In the latter case, myth approximates to what Silberer, 1909, has described as functional phenomena. Confer Freud, 1900a, Standard Edition 5, page 503 in the following pages. The view maintained by Jung, 1912, that the god who kills the animal is a libidinal symbol implies a concept of libido other than that which has hitherto been employed, and seems to me questionable from every point of view. Returning to the main text. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to suppose that the hostile impulses inherent in the father complex were completely silenced during this period of revived paternal authority. On the contrary, the first phases of the dominance of the two new father surrogates, gods and kings, show the most energetic signs of the ambivalence that remains a characteristic of religion. In his great work, The Golden Bough, Fraser, 1911a, Volume 2, Chapter 18, puts forward the view that the earliest kings of the Latin tribes were foreigners, who played the part of a god and were solemnly executed at a particular festival. The annual sacrifice, or, as a variant, self-sacrifice of a god, seems to have been an essential element in the Semitic religions. The ceremonials of human sacrifice, performed in the most different parts of the inhabited globe, leave very little doubt that the victims met their end as representatives of the deity, and these sacrificial rites can be traced into late times, with an inanimate effigy or puppet taking the place of the living human being. The theanthropic sacrifice of the god, into which it is unfortunately impossible for me to enter here as fully as in the animal sacrifice, throws a searching retrospective light upon the meaning of the older forms of sacrifice. Smith, 1894, page 410f. It confesses, with a frankness that could hardly be excelled, to the fact that the object of the act of sacrifice has always been the same, namely what is now worshipped as God, that is to say, the Father. The problem of the relation between animal and human sacrifice thus admits of a simple solution. The original animal sacrifice was already a substitute for a human sacrifice, for the ceremonial killing of the father, so that when the father surrogate once more resumed its human shape, the animal sacrifice too could be changed back into a human sacrifice. The memory of the first great act of sacrifice thus proved indestructible, in spite of every effort to forget it, and at the very point at which men sought to be at the farthest distance from the motives that led to it, its undistorted reproduction emerged in the form of the sacrifice of the god. I need not enlarge here upon the developments of religious thought which, in the shape of rationalizations, made this recurrence possible. Robertson Smith, who had no thought of our derivation of sacrifice from the great event in human prehistory, states that the ceremonies at the festivals in which the ancient Semites celebrated the death of a deity were currently interpreted as the commemoration of a mythical tragedy. Ibid, page 413. The mourning, he declares, is not a spontaneous expression of sympathy with the divine tragedy, but obligatory and enforced by fear of supernatural anger. And a chief object of the mourners is to disclaim responsibility for the god's death, a point which has already come before us in connection with theanthropic sacrifices, such as the ox murder at Athens, Ibid, page 412. It seems most probable that these current interpretations were correct, and that the feelings of the celebrants were fully explained by the underlying situation. Let us assume it to be a fact, then, that in the course of the later developments of religion, the two driving factors, the son's sense of guilt and the son's rebelliousness, never became extinct. whatever attempt was made at resolving the religious problem, whatever kind of reconciliation was effected between these two opposing mental forces, sooner or later broke down under the combined influence, no doubt, of historical events, cultural changes, and internal psychic modifications. The son's efforts to put himself in the place of the Father God became ever more obvious. The introduction of agriculture increased the son's importance in the patriarchal family. He ventured upon new demonstrations of his incestuous libido, which found symbolic satisfaction in his cultivation of Mother Earth. Divine figures such as Attis, Adonis, and Tammuz emerged, spirits of vegetation, and at the same time youthful divinities, enjoying the favors of mother goddesses and committing incest with their mother in defiance of their father. But the sense of guilt, which was not allayed by these creations, found expression in myths which granted only short lives to these youthful favorites of the mother goddesses, and decreed their punishment by emasculation or by the wrath of the father in the form of an animal. Adonis was killed by a wild boar, the sacred animal of Aphrodite. Attis, beloved of Cybele, perished by castration. The mourning for these gods and the rejoicings over their resurrection passed over into the ritual of another sun deity who was destined to lasting success. Footnote 1. Fear of castration plays an extremely large part in the case of the youthful neurotics whom we come across as an interference in their relations with their father. The illuminating instance reported by Ferenczi, 1913a, has shown us how a little boy took as his totem the beast that had pecked at his little penis. When our Jewish children come to hear of ritual circumcision, they equate it with castration. The parallel in social psychology to this reaction by children has not yet been worked out, so far as I am aware. In primeval times and in primitive races, where circumcision is so frequent, it is performed at the age of initiation into manhood, and it is at that age that its significance is to be found. It was only a secondary development that it was shifted back to the early years of life. It is of very great interest to find that among primitive peoples, circumcision is combined with cutting the hair and knocking out teeth, or is replaced by them, and that our children, who cannot possibly have any knowledge of this, in fact treat these two operations, and the anxiety with which they react to them, as equivalents of castration. Returning to the main text. When Christianity first penetrated into the ancient world, it met with competition from the religion of Mithras, and for a time it was doubtful which of the two deities would gain the victory. In spite of the halo of light surrounding his form, the youthful Persian god remains obscure to us. We may perhaps infer from the sculptures of Mithras slaying a bull that he represented a son who was alone in sacrificing his father, and thus redeemed his brothers from their burden of complicity in the deed. There was an alternative method of allaying their guilt, and this was first adopted by Christ. He sacrificed his own life and so redeemed the company of brothers from original sin. The doctrine of original sin was of Orphic origin. It formed a part of the mysteries and spread from them to the schools of philosophy of ancient Greece. Reinach, 1905-12, Volume 2, page 75 ff. Mankind, it was said, were descended from the Titans, who had killed the young Dionysus Zagreus and had torn him to pieces. The burden of this crime weighed on them. A fragment of Anaximander relates how the unity of the world was broken by a primeval sin. Footnote 2. Une sorte de péché prothnique. Reinach, 1905-12, Volume 2, page 76. The burden of this crime weighed on them. A fragment of Anaximander relates how the unity of the world was broken by a primeval sin, and that whatever issued from it must bear the punishment. The tumultuous mobbing, the killing and the tearing in pieces by the Titans reminds us clearly enough of the totemic sacrifice described by St. Nilus, Ibid, Volume 2, page 93, as, for the matter of that, do many other ancient myths, including, for instance, that of the death of Orpheus himself. Nevertheless, there is a disturbing difference in the fact of the murder having been committed on a youthful god. There can be no doubt that in the Christian myth, the original sin was one against God the Father. If, however, Christ redeemed mankind from the burden of original sin by the sacrifice of his own life, we are driven to conclude that the sin was a murder. The law of Talion, which is so deeply rooted in human feelings, lays it down that a murder can only be expiated by the sacrifice of another life. Self-sacrifice points back to blood guilt. Footnote 1. We find that impulses to suicide in a neurotic turn out regularly to be self-punishments for wishes for someone else's death. Returning to the main text. The law of Talion, which is so deeply rooted in human feelings, lays it down that a murder can only be expiated by the sacrifice of another life. Self-sacrifice points back to blood guilt. And if this sacrifice of a life brought about atonement with God the Father, the crime to be expiated can only have been the murder of the Father. In the Christian doctrine, therefore, men were acknowledging in the most undisguised manner the guilty primeval deed, since they found the fullest atonement for it in the sacrifice of this one Son. Atonement with the Father was all the more complete, since the sacrifice was accompanied by a total renunciation of the women on whose account the rebellion against the Father was started. But at that point, the inexorable psychological law of ambivalence stepped in. The very deed in which the Son offered the greatest possible atonement to the Father brought him at the same time to the attainment of his wishes against the Father. He himself became God, beside, or more correctly, in place of the Father. A Son religion displaced the Father religion. As a sign of this substitution, the ancient totem meal was revived in the form of communion, in which the company of brothers consumed the flesh and blood of the Son, no longer the Father, obtained sanctity thereby, and identified themselves with him. Thus we can trace through the ages the identity of the totem meal with animal sacrifice, with theanthropic human sacrifice, and with the Christian Eucharist, and we can recognize in all these rituals the effect of the crime by which men were so deeply weighed down, but of which they must nonetheless feel so proud. The Christian communion, however, is essentially a fresh elimination of the Father, a repetition of the guilty deed. We can see the full justice of Fraser's pronouncement that the Christian communion has absorbed within itself a sacrament which is doubtless older than Christianity. Footnote 1. Fraser, 1912, Volume 2, page 51. No one familiar with the literature of the subject will imagine that the derivation of Christian communion from the totem meal is an idea originating from the author of the present essay. 7. An event such as the elimination of the primal Father by the company of his sons must inevitably have left ineradicable traces in the history of humanity. And the less it itself was recollected, the more numerous must have been the substitutes to which it gave rise. Footnote 2. In Ariel's words from The Tempest, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." Returning to the main text. I shall resist the temptation of pointing out these traces in mythology where they are not hard to find, and shall turn in another direction and take up a suggestion made by Solomon Reinach in a most instructive essay on the death of Orpheus. Footnote 3. La Mort d'Orphée, contained in the volume which I have so often quoted, 1905-12, Volume 2, page 100 ff. In the history of Greek art, we come upon a situation which shows striking resemblances to the scene of the totem meal as identified by Robertson Smith, and not less profound differences from it. I have in mind the situation of the most ancient Greek tragedy. A company of individuals, named and dressed alike, surrounded by a single figure, all hanging upon his words and deeds. They were the chorus and the impersonator of the hero. He was originally the only actor. Later, a second and third actor were added, to play as counterpart to the hero and as characters split off from him. But the character of the hero himself and his relation to the chorus remained unaltered. The hero of tragedy must suffer. To this day, that remains the essence of a tragedy. He had to bear the burden of what was known as tragic guilt. The basis of that guilt is not always easy to find, for in the light of our everyday life, it is often no guilt at all. As a rule, it lay in rebellion against some divine or human authority, and the chorus accompanied the hero with feelings of sympathy, sought to hold him back, to warn him and to sober him, and mourned over him when he had met with what was felt as the merited punishment for his rash undertaking. But why had the hero of tragedy to suffer, and what was the meaning of his tragic guilt? I will cut the discussion short and give a quick reply. He had to suffer because he was the primal father, the hero of the great primeval tragedy, which was being reenacted with a tendentious twist. And the tragic guilt was the guilt which he had to take on himself in order to relieve the chorus from theirs. The scene upon the stage was derived from the historical scene through a process of systematic distortion. One might even say it's the product of a refined hypocrisy. In the remote reality, it had actually been the members of the chorus who caused the hero's suffering. Now, however, they exhausted themselves with sympathy and regret, and it was the hero himself who was responsible for his own sufferings. The crime which was thrown onto his shoulders, presumptuousness and rebelliousness against a great authority, was precisely the crime for which the members of the chorus, the company of brothers, were responsible. Thus the tragic hero became, though it might be against his will, the redeemer of the chorus. In Greek tragedy, the special subject matter of the performance was the sufferings of the divine goat, Dionysus, and the lamentation of the goats who were his followers and who identified themselves with him. That being so, it is easy to understand how drama, which had become extinct, was kindled into fresh life in the Middle Ages around the Passion of Christ. At the conclusion, then, of this exceedingly condensed inquiry, I should like to insist that its outcome shows that the beginnings of religion, morals, society, and art converge in the Oedipus complex. This is in complete agreement with the psychoanalytic finding that the same complex constitutes the nucleus of all neuroses, so far as our present knowledge goes. It seems to me a most surprising discovery that the problems of social psychology, too, should prove soluble on the basis of one single concrete point: man's relation to his father. It is even possible that yet another psychological problem belongs in this same connection. I have often had occasion to point out that emotional ambivalence in the proper sense of the term, that is, the simultaneous existence of love and hate towards the same object, lies at the root of many important cultural institutions. We know nothing of the origin of this ambivalence. One possible assumption is that it is a fundamental phenomenon of our emotional life. But it seems to me quite worth considering another possibility, namely that originally it formed no part of our emotional life, but was acquired by the human race in connection with their father complex, precisely where the psychoanalytic examination of modern individuals still finds it revealed at its strongest. Footnote 1, or more correctly, their parental complex. Footnote 2, since I am used to being misunderstood, I think it worthwhile to insist explicitly that the derivations which I have proposed in these pages do not in the least overlook the complexity of the phenomena under review. All that they claim is to have added a new factor to the sources, known or still unknown, of religion, morality, and society, a factor based on a consideration of the implications of psychoanalysis. I must leave to others the task of synthesizing the explanation into a unity. It does, however, follow from the nature of the new contribution that it could not play any other than a central part in such a synthesis, even though powerful emotional resistances might have to be overcome before its great importance was recognized. Returning to the main text. But it seems to me quite worth considering another possibility, namely that originally it formed no part of our emotional life, but was acquired by the human race in connection with their father complex, precisely where the psychoanalytic examination of modern individuals still finds it revealed at its strongest. Before I bring my remarks to a close, however, I must find room to point out that though my arguments have led to a high degree of convergence upon a single comprehensive nexus of ideas, this fact cannot blind us to the uncertainties of my premises or the difficulties involved in my conclusions. I will only mention two of the latter, which may have forced themselves on the notice of a number of my readers. No one can have failed to observe, in the first place, that I have taken as the basis of my whole position the existence of a collective mind, in which mental processes occur just as they do in the mind of an individual. In particular, I have supposed that the sense of guilt for an action has persisted for many thousands of years and has remained operative in generations which can have had no knowledge of that action. I have supposed that an emotional process, such as might have developed in generations of sons who were ill-treated by their father, has extended to new generations which were exempt from such treatment for the very reason that their father had been eliminated. It must be admitted that these are grave difficulties, and any explanation that could avoid presumptions of such a kind would seem to be preferable. Further reflection, however, will show that I am not alone in the responsibility for this bold procedure. Without the assumption of a collective mind, which makes it possible to neglect the interruptions of mental acts caused by the extinction of the individual, social psychology in general cannot exist. Unless psychical processes were continued from one generation to another, if each generation were obliged to acquire its attitude to life anew, there would be no progress in this field and next to no development. This gives rise to two further questions. How much can we attribute to psychical continuity in the sequence of generations? And what are the ways and means employed by one generation in order to hand on its mental states to the next one? I shall not pretend that these problems are sufficiently explained, or that direct communication and tradition, which are the first things that occur to one, are enough to account for the process. Social psychology shows very little interest on the whole in the manner in which the required continuity in the mental life of successive generations is established. A part of the problem seems to be met by the inheritance of psychical dispositions, which, however, need to be given some sort of impetus in the life of the individual before they can be roused into actual operation. This may be the meaning of the poet's words, Was de Erbt von deinen Watten hast, erwerb es es zu besitzen. Footnote 1. Goethe, Faust, Part 1, Scene 1. What thou hast inherited from thy fathers, acquire it to make it thine. The problem would seem even more difficult if we had to admit that mental impulses could be so completely suppressed as to leave no trace whatever behind them, but that is not the case. Even the most ruthless suppression must leave room for distorted surrogate impulses and for reactions resulting from them. If so, however, we may safely assume that no generation is able to conceal any of its more important mental processes from its successor. For psychoanalysis has shown us that everyone possesses in his unconscious mental activity an apparatus which enables him to interpret other people's reactions. That is, to undo the distortions which other people have imposed on the expression of their feelings. An unconscious understanding such as this of all the customs, ceremonies, and dogmas left behind by the original relation to the father may have made it possible for later generations to take over their heritage of emotion. Another difficulty might actually be brought forward from psychoanalytic quarters. The earliest moral precepts and restrictions in primitive society have been explained by us as reactions to a deed, which gave those who performed it the concept of crime. They felt remorse for the deed and decided that it should never be repeated and that its performance should bring no advantage. This creative sense of guilt still persists among us. We find it operating in an asocial manner in neurotics and producing new moral precepts and persistent restrictions as an atonement for crimes that have been committed and as a precaution against the committing of new ones. Footnote 1. Confer the essay on taboo, the second in this work, page 67 ff. This creative sense of guilt still persists among us. We find it operating in an asocial manner in neurotics and producing new moral precepts and persistent restrictions as an atonement for crimes that have been committed and as a precaution against the committing of new ones. If, however, we inquire among these neurotics to discover what were the deeds which provoked these reactions, we shall be disappointed. We find no deeds, but only impulses and emotions, set upon evil ends, but held back from their achievement. What lie behind the sense of guilt of neurotics are always psychical realities and never factual ones. What characterizes neurotics is that they prefer psychical to factual reality and react just as seriously to thoughts as normal people do to realities. May not the same have been true of primitive men? We are justified in believing that, as one of the phenomena of their narcissistic organization, they overhauled their psychical acts to an extraordinary degree. Footnote 2. Confer the third essay in this work, page 85. Accordingly, the mere hostile impulse against the father, the mere existence of a wishful fantasy of killing and devouring him, would have been enough to produce the moral reaction that created totemism and taboo. In this way, we should avoid the necessity for deriving the origin of our cultural legacy, of which we justly feel so proud, from a hideous crime revolting to all our feelings. No damage would thus be done to the causal chain stretching from the beginning to the present day, for psychical reality would be strong enough to bear the weight of these consequences. To this it may be objected that an alteration in the form of society from a patriarchal horde to a fraternal clan did actually take place. This is a powerful argument, but not a conclusive one. The alteration might have been effected in a less violent fashion, and nonetheless have been capable of determining the appearance of the moral reaction. So long as the pressure exercised by the primal father could be felt, the hostile feelings towards him were justified, and remorse on their account would have to await a later day. And if it is further argued that everything derived from the ambivalent relation to the father, taboo and the sacrificial ordinance, is characterized by the deepest seriousness and the most complete reality, this further objection carries just as little weight. For the ceremonials and inhibitions of obsessional neurotics show these same characteristics, and are nevertheless derived only from psychical reality, from intentions, and not from their execution. We must avoid transplanting a contempt for what is merely thought or wished from our commonplace world, with its wealth of material values, into the world of primitive men and neurotics, of which the wealth lies only within themselves. Here we are faced by a decision which is indeed no easy one. First, however, it must be confessed that the distinction, which may seem fundamental to other people, does not, in our judgment, affect the heart of the matter. If wishes and impulses have the full value of facts for primitive men, it is our business to give their attitude our understanding attention, instead of correcting it in accordance with our own standards. Let us then examine more closely the case of neurosis, comparison with which led us into our present uncertainty. It is not accurate to say that obsessional neurotics, weighed down under the burden of an excessive morality, are defending themselves only against psychical reality and are punishing themselves for impulses which were merely felt. Historical reality has a share in the matter as well. In their childhood, they had these evil impulses pure and simple, and turned them into acts so far as the impotence of childhood allowed. Each of these excessively virtuous individuals passed through an evil period in his infancy, a phase of perversion, which was the forerunner and precondition of the later period of excessive morality. The analogy between primitive men and neurotics will therefore be far more fully established if we suppose that in the former instance, too, psychical reality, as to the form taken, by which we are in no doubt, coincided at the beginning with factual reality, that primitive men actually did what all the evidence shows that they intended to do. Nor must we let ourselves be influenced too far in our judgment of primitive men by the analogy of neurotics. There are distinctions, too, which must be borne in mind. It is no doubt true that the sharp contrast that we make between thinking and doing is absent in both of them. But neurotics are above all inhibited in their actions. With them, the thought is a complete substitute for the deed. Primitive men, on the other hand, are uninhibited. Thought passes directly into action. With them, it is rather the deed that is a substitute for the thought. And that is why, without laying claim to any finality of judgment, I think that in the case before us it may safely be assumed that in the beginning was the deed. Footnote 1. Im Anfang war die Tat. Goethe Faust, Part 1, Scene 3. Freud's line of thought in this essay was taken up and carried further by him in his group Psychology, 1921c, Chapter 10. Later still, in The Future of an Illusion, 1927c, particularly in Chapter 4, and finally in his Moses and Monotheism, 1939a.